This is going to be a short video, I hope, summarising the longer video we had on bias and error, and particularly looking at the practicalities of mitigating the effects of making a mistake and also being biased. You can see from the picture that your bias is attracting your diagnosis, and your bias and error measurement is attracting it as well. So this thing gets stuck in the middle. One side has to win, and it will pretty much be your bias and your ability to make mistakes. What you're hoping is that the levels of that bias and those mistakes are low enough to be acceptable for you to make the diagnosis. It's very unlikely you're going to get rid of all of your biases and all of your mistakes, certainly not in the first go round making the diagnosis. Mostly your errors, your random mistakes, will show up when your treatment results are not matching the prognosis you made. So that's what we're doing in this one, and I hope I get it to work for you. There are two things to understand here. One is that we are doing inferential reasoning, and that's always probabilistic. There is no 100% certainty, there is no 0% certainty in any conclusions you make. There's always room for doubt and error. Second thing to know is basically that you're going to be biased, and you are going to make mistakes. This applies to everybody. There's nothing much you can do about being unbiased when it comes to implicit bias. When it comes to explicit bias, you know you're biased, and it's your job not to express that, either in action or in words. If you do, then that's prejudice, and it's really not acceptable, certainly not in clinical reasoning. Implicit bias, so you don't know you've got it. So given that, you have to take steps to remove it. Assume it's present, and then take steps to make sure that it isn't, or if it is, reduce the effect of that bias. You may not be able to get rid of it entirely, but you're going to try and bring it down to acceptable levels. So these are the two things that you fully have to understand about inferential reasoning. The next thing to understand and act on is the fact that your first go round is not your diagnosis. This is a provisional diagnosis that must then be attacked by bias and error mitigation. And it's only when it withstands that attack that it can now become the working diagnosis from which you can plan treatment, prognosis, and so on. To that point, though, you'd be unwise if you didn't try to see what types of error and bias were built into that diagnosis. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait until you're treating the patient, and then the results of your treatment is not matching your prognosis, and you've wasted a number of visits finding that out, whereas you may well have found it out within 5 minutes of making your diagnosis. Provisional diagnosis comes first. Your working diagnosis comes after that. Now, in medicine, they do the same thing. The clinical diagnosis based on the patient's history, physical exam, is the provisional diagnosis. Not the final diagnosis, that comes when everything's worked out the way you expect it to do. But your working diagnosis now comes when you get lab results back, imaging test studies and stuff like that confirm the clinical opinion. However, we don't do that. You have to make the provisional diagnosis followed by the working diagnosis, all within the same treatment. So, provisional diagnosis first, followed by the working diagnosis after you've done your bias and error correction. Everything else is risky. Okay, so making sure that your attitude is properly adjusted, we can then look at the specifics of reducing bias and error. Now, there's all the airy-fairy stuff that goes on about, as I say, adjusting your attitude, not taking things for granted, and so on and so on and so on. It's all well and good, and it's all stuff that you should aim at, but you need concrete operations that you can use to reduce bias. The big one here, the major one really, is differential diagnosis. Why not compare, if you've done hypothetical abduction, why not compare your final, what you think is your final diagnosis, which is actually a provisional diagnosis, with other conditions that can look the same. So differential diagnosis. Now, if you use exclusionary differential diagnosis, that has speed built into it. Speed and a little bit more reliability on the outcome. You're trying to eliminate things, and it's a lot easier to eliminate than to include in. So you want highly specific, highly sensitive tests and questions, and if they turn out to be negative, you can then eliminate that possible diagnosis, at least provisionally. So you get the speed built in, you'll get it over and done with and move on. If you're using inclusionary differential diagnosis, then you're going to improve your accuracy. It's going to take a lot longer because you have to positively vet each one. You're trying to include them now rather than exclude them, and that takes longer and it's a little less reliable. But at the end of the process, you're probably going to pick up more bias issues and errors than if you did exclusionary differential diagnosis. So I would suggest that you use XDDX for fairly straightforward problems like lateral elbow pain, and IDDX when you're unfamiliar, particularly when you're unfamiliar with the condition, or you've got a whole bunch of plausible conditions that could fit the bill. In fact, in those two circumstances, you probably want to use differential diagnosis as your primary method of diagnosis rather than hypothetic abduction. Now, if you do use differential diagnosis, including differential diagnosis, then you don't have to worry about this particular form of bias error mitigation. It's already been done, providing you've actually looked at every one of these as a whole, rather than going through one after the other one, and stops at the one you think is the best. You make a list, you work your way through it, and you see at the end of the process which of those best fits the patient's symptoms. While differential diagnosis will take care of most of the biases, it won't take care of confirmation bias. The patient is giving you answers, and if you interpret those answers incorrectly, the way you want them to come out, there's nothing that differential diagnosis can really do about that. Similarly, when you're doing tests, if you misinterpret those, then the same thing's going to happen. Now, these misinterpretations are bias. Sometimes you just don't hear them, and that's a random error. There's not a lot you can do about that. But if you're misinterpreting, that's pure bias. So we're all guilty of it. I actually saw I was watching a therapist work once. It was on a residency, and I watched him take the history from the patient. And in the end, he said, "I think it's a mechanical low back problem. So I think you think it's a biomechanical dysfunction." So he said, "Yeah." I said, "What about the severe leg pain?" And he said, he didn't have leg pain. So I asked the patient, I said, "Have you got leg pain?" He said, "Oh yeah, it really hurts me down the back of the leg." The therapist just never heard it. I don't think that was selective deafness. Well, it was selective deafness, but I don't think that was because he didn't hear it audibly. He didn't hear it mentally. And this is what happens. And although it seems unbelievable, this is exactly what happens. So the way to overcome that particular type of bias, a confirmation bias, is to repeat the key answers back to the patient. And then at the end of the process, ask the patient if he agrees with your assessment of what he said. If he disagrees, it doesn't mean to say you're wrong, but it does give you pause to wonder why there is a disagreement there. So this is just a matter of confirming what the patient said at the time he said it. And that should reduce the risk of confirmation bias. At the end of the process, if you are completely convinced you're right, you've got the right solution, you're absolutely sure of it, you're probably wrong. You need to check that particular conclusion, because you should never be that comfortable with anything. And it may well be that you're right. It's something very simple and you know what it is. On the other hand, if there's more of a complex problem, you cannot have that much self-confidence. You just can't. So the more sure you are of something, the more you want to check it. So that's it, really. This is your bias and error mitigation. It doesn't take any time at all with exclusionary differential diagnosis. It's an ongoing process as far as confirmation bias is concerned. Just keep repeating back. Don't be tedious about it. It doesn't have to be done after every question, but at some point or another in that process, you ask those questions back to the patient and make sure you agree on it. You do those two things and you won't go too far wrong. Then your final check on how right you were on your diagnosis comes at the end of the process. You're into treatment now, and you then match up the prognosis you made at the time with the results of your treatment. And if they're not matching up, something's gone wrong somewhere. So this process will keep your conclusions and decisions much more likely to be accurate than if you don't do this. It's worth doing. Eventually you'll develop pattern recognition, but even then, there should be a couple of different checks on it. And pattern recognition experts do exactly that. They do it unconsciously, though. They will recognize a pattern. They will immediately come to a diagnosis. It's usually spot on. But what they've done as well, unconsciously, is compared that pattern with various other conditions unconsciously and then arrived at it. So they've done the same process as I'm expecting you to do. So experts do the same thing, they just don't think about it. You may have to. All right, guys, you take care.